Well, hello. Welcome back to another exciting edition of Coffee with Steven. So, this week's blog is entitled The Cool Ones. And it's kind of an interesting take. As most of you guys already know, our younger daughter Cheney was home for the Christmas weekend from our Christmas 2 weeks from West Point. And during all the festivities, we had some downtime. And Sandy had mentioned that the new Matrix movie was available for us to watch at home streaming. Matrix Resurrection, I believe. Now, Cheney had never seen the original Matrix movies. She's familiar with them, but she had never actually watched them. But she wanted to see it, and we agreed. We thought it would be kind of cool. And I definitely remember enjoying, well, the first Matrix movie. Maybe the second and third, not so much. But, nonetheless, I was excited to watch it with her. And as the movie started, I remembered distinctly an event that had taken place probably about 12 years, or maybe even longer than that, when Carolyn, our older daughter, was about 8 years old. We decided to have her watch Star Wars with us. And, Star Wars was really instrumental for me as a kid growing up. And I naturally assumed that Carolyn would feel the same way. And as we started watching it, I realized that the movies that I had remembered from my youth didn't necessarily have the same emotional impact now as an adult. In fact, to be honest with you, I thought they were garbage. Well, as we were watching The Matrix Resurrection, I'm not going to give you any spoilers or anything like that, but I was generally kind of disappointed in it, to be blunt. But that notwithstanding, there were a couple of interesting things that happened in it that sort of created the muse for this blog. One of the biggies is that the overarching paradigm of the movie is that collectivism is fundamentally bad, that reliance upon some sort of overarching governmental organization, or in this particular case, computer-driven organization, is inherently dehumanizing. Now, this, say, 20 years ago, when The Matrix was first introduced, well, many people would look at that and say, oh, well, this is an anti-conservative movie because conservatives are the ones that are looking for this big government. And I never actually bought off on that idea. But now, over the last year and a half, the script has been flipped. We're now on the other side. And it made me remember a movie that came out in 2005, which I highly recommend that you guys see, called V for Vendetta. And I'm sure most of you have already seen it. If you haven't, definitely watch it. If you have seen it, watch it again. Because when that movie originally came out, it was generally sort of assumed that the antagonists were sort of an overarching conservative government. But they never actually postulate the idea that the government itself is in fact conservative. Quite the opposite, if you think about it. And as we watch it today with the current regime that's in place, we actually start to see that there's this movement in the literati that is antagonistic towards collectivism. Sure, they've always been present, right? They've always articulated this ideal, but now in the face of what we see as our current reality, it's stark and it's apparent. And this also made me think, and I mentioned this in the blog, obviously, a George Orwell, sort of an essay, really, not really a book, called Killing an Elephant. Now, most of you guys are probably familiar with George Orwell's 1984, An Animal Farm. But Killing an Elephant is actually, in my opinion, probably one of the better works that he did. And the basis of the short story is that he was stationed in India as effectively an operator within the British colonial system. And there was an elephant that went mad and killed a bunch of villagers. And he was tasked with going out and actually killing this thing. And the biggest concern that he had, because that was the concern that his, superiors had, was not that he succeed in actually killing the elephant. Well, the biggest concern was that he not look like a fool in front of the Indian villagers. The biggest fear that the state has is ridicule. It's being subjected to satirical humor. We saw that in V for Vendetta. There's a really telling scene in that movie where basically a television host decides to parody the prime minister, and he's like subsequently disappeared, and we're left to believe that he was probably executed for his transgressions. But we see that today. We see this sort of antagonistic, attack on humor, and there's a reason for that. Humor, satirical humor especially, is extraordinarily biting and is funny because it directly goes against the dominant paradigm. Well, today, the dominant paradigm is liberal ideology. And more specifically, I would say collectivist ideology with an authoritarian bent, because liberal ideology, in my opinion, requires some level of authoritarianism in order to promulgate it. Well, again, the state or those in power cannot tolerate the idea of being made fun of. We've seen this going way back to the parables, in the famous parable of the emperor having no clothes. The ultimate standpoint at the end of that was that the little boy who finally articulated what everybody saw, that the emperor has no clothes, essentially held up the entire state as embodied by the emperor for ultimate ridicule. We'll see how this actually, plays itself out over the long term, but it was instructive and it was interesting, and hopefully you enjoy the blog and might cause you to, binge watch a couple of flicks over the weekend. In any event, I want you to train constantly, train consistently, train repetitively, train with purpose. Above all else, stay safe.